Evening, everyone. We're a bit past 5:30, so we can begin now. Jack, if you can hear the image, see the image well and hear me, just let me know.
Yeah, I can see it.
Good. All right, off we go. So today is our bio check. We're supposed to be done with our biography, so I'll check up on that really quick. I thought, and then we're going to spend the bulk of the time talking about Taliesin because it's not the penultimate prairie home. That's probably the Roby house, which you've drawn already. But it probably is the most romantic prairie home because of the story behind it and the sense that it is the actual studio of Wright for the bulk of his career, and all the major UNESCO sites really emanated from that site up there. So it's a pretty important building. And when we draw that, you'll see it's very difficult to capture in a singular image. We'll do our best. But I thought I'd start out with this image here because this is what you guys are doing. You selected to go down one of these two paths. One is either the prairie or the Usonian, or it could be a hybrid. And I'll show you how to do a hybrid here because that's where we ended up recently with a project up in Hayward. So this is what something sort of what you just went through with your sketch is what I will show a client when they ask for a residence. And we've done a whole bunch in our career. And when we ask for it, we have our particular leanings where we like mid-century modern Usonian language. We also like the prairie language, and we're sort of good at that. So we can kind of see their site really quickly and sketch something out to drive the way how they react to some of the images we show them. So not unlike we submitted last week, that's the kind of level that we do the first brush through before the client actually commits and said, we don't want something that traditional, we want, or they do want something that traditional, or they'll steer away from that and they've got something else they have in mind. But at least we'll always try to tease them with the notion that this sort of proto-Wrightian language is pretty adaptable to lots of clients' contemporary usages here. So this was emanated from a site up in Hayward, Wisconsin. It's on the name of a French lake. I think it's called Lac d'Oreille, which is French for ear. The lake is sort of shaped like an ear, and so they're on one edge of it facing east. So really quickly, just to show you what the next step for you guys will be down the road, will be to get to three-dimensional commitment. And in this case, for us, and this will be hard to get all on screen, is we simply did sort of a sketch model out of it too, which helped us draw perspectives in later. And we had the roofing sort of removable so that they can see some of the key spaces inside. But if you look at the plan type here, it's not unlike what a lot of you submitted last week. It is sort of a traditional L shape with a kick out. The L base bumps out toward the lake that they're on. So this side of it cascades down. And if I remove the two roof planes, you'll see the two principal volumes. It has the major 1.5 story living space, and then sort of their master bedroom overlooking the lake. And the rest is just secondary functions for the house proper. To give you a quick view of it without going too far into the detail, this is sort of street side, forest side that leads you into the shape. And you can see it kind of takes on a Usonian massing there. And then the lake side, it's got a nice sort of promontory that faces the lake and lots of cascading decks that come down. And once you come to the base of the model, that's where it steps down at 75 feet to the water level. So this is just, again, a very quick crude model out of a wood product to sort of articulate the notion of what this home might look like. Because clients, you'll find out down the road, can see in perspective. That's why you do your sketches like this. And they really struggle, even though the plan shows them size and scale, they understand the relationship. So the quicker you get into a model where you can put them on the site, or drawings that are three-dimensional, they can put them on the site and walk them around some video file you could do through the notion of actually getting them on the site, the better you're going to have interaction with them. And we believe that we're just drawing their vision. And they love the idea that it's their home that way, rather than somebody they bought off the shelf from somebody else and somebody else's idea if you can gauge them. So I just want to try to ratify that notion that you're not doing this just for academic exercise. I think it's also a professional experience for you to get these skill sets down and be able to talk very quickly to a client about ideas, rather than having to have, I can't talk to you until I have 2 weeks with my computer. You should be able to talk to them in an hour. And sometimes it even helps to be able to draw into your sketches while you're talking to them. So they see that the breadth of your imagination is actually coming from you through your eyes, to your hand, to your pencil point. And so that's still going to be your greatest software. Obviously, you'll do your Revit set of drawings for the contractor to bid on it, but they're buying into the fact that you can actually create ideas with the pencil in a sense. So I advocate for that as part of your career. Eventually the mouse, but certainly pen, pencil before the mouse. So our start today, before we get to your base drawing here of the Taliesin sketch, and we'll talk about the history as we draw along with that, is, and then I'll take you to the site too and show you the specifics of what's Taliesin, what's like out there. What we need to do is to kind of check where you are with your biographies, because there's a point to that. It wasn't just sort of interesting reading. It's something you really should learn about, and it will affect your information here as you step closer to Wright in the semester. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a 24 question test here, with the answer on the page. So you get 4 answers for each. And all I want you to do is write down number 1 and then 1, 2, 3, or 4. What answer you think is correct. Then you'll self-grade yourself. And if you are missing way too many points, that means you need to finish your biography, start reading your biography, or reread it. Because if you can't answer these 24 questions after reading your biography, there's sort of a misconnect there. Because these are really global issues which pull out key aspects in his career. So I'm going to zoom in here. And our first question. You can get out just a tablet of paper now. And we'll do one by one. And I'm just going to pick on people in the class to give us the correct answer here as we move forward. The first question that I want you to answer is, which of these following structures are not ecclesiastical buildings? They're not religious, spiritual buildings. Is it 1, 2, 3, or 4? So Max, we'll start at the top. What's the answer there?
I'm not sure.
Angela, what's the answer?
That would be Monona Terrace.
Correct. So Monona Terrace, and sort of even beyond that, here it's sort of a trick question because Monona Terrace, from my point of view, is not a Wright structure. The architect of record for the state of Wisconsin is Tony Putnam, and he did this building in the 90s. So Wright had been dead for 40 years by the time Monona Terrace was actually designed and built in Madison. And yet, when you tour it, they will say Frank Lloyd Wright designed it, which is the misnomer, because number one, in our case, it's not a church building, the other 3 are. But in this case, it's off of a design that Wright did for a convention center in the 30s that has the same global ideas of the spatial plane and stuff. But Wright's scheme was really for performance art and not really convention like it is now. Right now, there's halls of space. It isn't about performance of music, it's about the performance of people talking about ideas. So they're sort of, they're shaped and they're cousins to each other, but it's erroneous to call it a Frank Lloyd Wright building because he's not the architect of it anymore. The DNR would never allow a building to project into the lake like the original Monona Terrace did. So that's number 1 is number 4. Next question. Who is not one of Wright's wives? Justin, could you handle this one?
Yeah, I believe the answer is Miriam Noel.
No, actually, it's a little tricky because Miriam is the shortest termed wife of Wright. Mama, who was, as people would write, the actual love of his life, had actually a short period with Wright because she was the one that was murdered in 1911 in Taliesin proper with the first fire. But they never married because Catherine, his first wife, never granted him a divorce until the 20s, about 1922. Then Miriam came in and married him. She had some psychological issues. They divorced a couple years later, and his third wife was Olga Vana. Number 3, where are the Lord Georges from? Wright's family, where are they from? Kenzie.
Is it England?
It's Wales. And that's a particular discerning because it's all 4 of those countries are kind of perceived as being kind of the British Empire. But the Welsh are very, very dignified and thinking that that's a different type of person that comes from Wales. And so the Joneses are really Welsh born, and that ties into our subject for today because Taliesin is a Welsh word that means shining brow. And we'll talk about that when we get to the site, but that's kind of key leading us into it here. 4th question. What state was not called home by Frank Lloyd Wright? Abby, can you answer that quickly for us?
Is it Arizona?
No, actually, he lived in Arizona as a homestead every winter when he developed bronchitis.
Okay.
So it seems like he's a Midwestern architect. So those other three, that's kind of I'm trying to shade the question a bit so it's not obvious. It seems like likely he could have lived in those three states, but he never
Yeah.
lived in Ohio. He had a residence in Illinois. He had his lifelong residence then later on in Wisconsin. And then he called his second home then Arizona, where he actually had a billing address for his firm down there. Now, speaking about that Taliesin West, it's key because this is a 40-year stretch here, and then it's got some really key social things happening around here. When was it established? And really, if you understand the society there, the actual year kind of jumps out because it can't happen at the other three dates. So let's see, who's next in line here? Tanner, can you tell us when Taliesin West was established?
Was it I'm pretty sure it was 1937.
Yeah, very good. So 27's out because the Depression hasn't hit yet. And that's what drove Wright to establish Taliesin West, so he could get students to do more labor for him and help him build this place out there for him. 47's way too late. That's a non-starter. And 1917 is the middle of World War I. That doesn't make sense either. So thank you. Okay, Wright did one skyscraper. He did several in design, and his greatest is probably the Illinois Tower, which was meant for Chicago. The mayor at the time even made it Frank Lloyd Wright Day in October when he presented it because it was so spectacular, but they thought he was insane because this was in the 50s when a man of about 90 was projecting a skyscraper taller than the Burj Dubai today, which is, again, 1.5 times the size of Sears Tower in Chicago. Wright was projecting something taller than that back in the 1950s. And yet the Burj Dubai is kind of quasi-based on the floor plan of Wright in terms of using triangles to create the structural for it. So where is this lone skyscraper actually built that Wright designed? And that would be Marissa?
Oklahoma.
Very good, Oklahoma. In a small town called Bartlesville. So one day when you're traveling the Southwest, heading down to New Mexico or Arizona or something, if you wake through Oklahoma, stay in it because now it's been converted from, it used to be apartments and office building kind of twinned up in the same volume. And that's why every elevation is different as you wrap around it. And now because it failed financially over the years, it's a kind of a boutique hotel, and all the interiors have been kind of rehabbed so they make more sense to Wright's original scheme. And that's in Bartlesville. Number 7. What was the name of that toolkit that kids use that Wright would have used in his day that his mother gave him at the age of 7, and people associate our first sketch, the Unity Temple, and other like ideas right at the time off of this toy he had growing up? And that'll be for M.
Was it the Lincoln Logs?
No, that's close because here's the weird thing. We read about this. His son, Lloyd Wright, designed Lincoln Logs, but that was kind of in the 50s. Froebel blocks are the ones that actually came from Germany, and they were used in a certain private educational kindergarten system that his mother got Wright introduced to. And so that training for Froebel blocks, if you find them online, they're incredibly expensive because they're beautiful. They're beautiful blocks that have got like systems of having the kids build certain ways. So they learn about composition, they learn about structure, they learn things that are not sort of abstract things with just that. Just like Lincoln Logs actually build a type of house or build things the way they're connected. Froebel blocks is a little more abstract and a little bit more tied to the actual curriculum of kindergarten. Number 8 for Sean. What's the name of the well-known house that Wright built for Mr. and Mrs. E.J. Kaufman, who owned an apartment store chain?
It was Falling Water.
Falling Water, very good. So the Kaufmans heard about Wright because their son went to the school for a bit and came back, said, you're going to build this retreat outside of Pittsburgh down by Bear Run. You have to use Frank Lloyd Wright. And so that became probably international most celebrated single family residence he ever did, even though it really wasn't a day-to-day residence. It was more like a weekend retreat or a summer retreat. But obviously it's the spectacle of his career in terms of residences. Number 9. And this is relative to you guys because you are getting a degree. You're approaching a degree. And so what's the most advanced degree Wright ever obtained? Oh, and sorry, that's for Iola. Or is it Lola? I can't tell if that's a capital L or an I.
It's Lola. Sorry.
Okay, Lola, sorry about that. They should have put a capital L there instead of just a. So anyway, what's your answer for that?
What is that? Does it say excluding honorary degree?
Yeah, because obviously when he gets you his fame, every college in the world will give you an honorary degree.
Oh,
So he's got a whole pile of those. But what actual degree did actually he acquire?
okay. I think he never finished any degree because he did leave the school in Madison. Is that right? Or did he get a high school diploma? Something like that.
Well, he couldn't have gotten in Madison without the high school diploma, though.
That's what I was thinking. So
Yeah,
that's
so
like,
he
we're talking about like college.
He completed high school, but never finished
Finished
the degree. Right. So there is a degree he did finish. So
Gotcha.
again, that was kind of a trap because most people know he didn't get the college degree, but
Mhm.
did he actually ever get a diploma? So he did get a high school one. Number 10. So Wright's father left when he was a teenager. So Matt, Liebermeister is a very affectionate name for like a father figure or a leader in your life from a young man to an old man. Who did Wright really respect to call him Liebermeister?
I think it was Louis Sullivan.
It is very correct. And, could have been Joseph Silsby. That's kind of that's the hook there to kind of mislead you because he was the first architect he worked for. But Wesley Peters was probably the one who he would have called Wright Liebermeister. And Ludwig Mies van der Rohe was a peer. He was sort of the same age level. Okay, almost done with the first page here, number 11. And that's Abby. Usonian homes are known for.
Is it the flat roofs?
Well,
All of the above.
you're partially correct.
All of the above.
All of the above. There you go. Right. So all 3. But that's, we take a test like this. If you think 2 of them are correct, well, that means all of them have to be correct, right? Because you can't answer 2. And so that's just a way of saying that they were really provocative in terms of ingenuity there. So he didn't invent that much for a prairie home, but he had to invent new things for housing in the Usonia to replace what he was missing. So the cantilever roofs were there as a system to heat and cool the house, to design. The floor heating was a system to eliminate the idea of having wasted hot and cold air floating around the room, where all you need is the actual connection of the heat to the human body. So you can have a lot lower energy if you're touching the warmth, as opposed to having the warmth just being around your skin. And obviously the flat roof lines are part of the whole project there for the cantilever roofs. Okay, back to Tanner for number 12. Which one of these 4 is not a key prairie home?
That's the Hollyhock house.
Hollyhock, very good. That came in the 20s out in California. And this is the one I kind of grumbled about when I told you about the 8 projects that are UNESCO sites. I think this is on the list. It's a wonderful home, obviously. All of his homes are wonderful. But it's not iconic in terms of his career. It just happens to hold the most impressionable building in California. I think the state's so big and has so many Wright works that they had to throw a bone, I think, California's way to kind of complete the list internationally. That's my take on it. But there's 8 other buildings I would substitute for the Hollyhock out there that are better in terms of that list. Okay, page 2. Remember, you're scoring your own here. Just be honest. There's no penalty here for your score. You're just going to prove whether or not you need to readdress your biography or not if you miss too many of these, because these are really kind of culturally significant touchstones of his life that stitch into why you're drawing what you're drawing. So he also stepped into planning with his idea for America with this utopian vision in the 30s and Usonian homes. And the name of that city was, for Ezekiel,
The Broadacre City?
Broadacre City. Very good. And unfortunately, if some of you are going to go out to Taliesin, it used to be the spectacle there that most people don't really get how important it was. But Wright created suburbia by showing people how to take their car into more of a quasi-rural landscape and have a little farmette and get away from sort of like the destitution, pollution, and compactness of the city and live like an American out in space. And that's what Broadacre kind of projected. And Taliesin, until all of the artwork of Wright went to New York, to MoMA, in their archives and in their halls and their galleries and things. It used to be sitting there. The model itself was sitting in Taliesin in one of the drafting studios. An original, beautiful piece of 20th century art done by the students there over a year and a half until they started, producing essays and a series of lectures on it. It just sat there in the air, wasn't very, well, it was dirty and kind of dusty and stuff, but it was kind of cool. It was just hanging on a wall. And it's enormous. It's about, I'd say 2 by 3 bays of the architecture building. So maybe 36 by 48 in its floor plan. So each section you buy into it, you could actually see a small Usonian home on it. So look up Broadacre City. It's a really cool idea for mid-20th century growth of America. Dabiata, what is not an unbuilt public commission? So 3 of these things are just fictitious things that Wright never actually got to build, and one actually was built.
Was it the Baghdad city?
Say it again?
Was it the Baghdad city?
No, actually, that was never created. He went out there and got, brought in by some of the people from that part of Asia to work on things. He worked on an Ahmedabad department store. This is like him when he was an 80-year-old man, 80 plus. Out of these 4, he actually built his largest project in terms of just number of square feet for the project. And that's that college down in Central Florida, right outside of Orlando. So when you make your trek to Disneyland down there, you guys as architects and engineers and artists and interior designers, you have to get to FSU, Florida Southern College University, and you'll see 13, 14, 15 buildings, dorms and libraries, and the chapel in the center, which brings it all together. It's an enormous project, all done by Wright as an elderly man. Ingram, Wright left for Chicago to work for which prestigious firm?
I'm unsure about this one. I'm leaning towards, let's say, Adler and Sullivan.
Right. And this is where obviously you've probably been taught by other people. You use the test you've already taken to answer some things further in the test. So if he calls Sullivan the Liebermeister, that kind of is a giveaway to say, well, that he must have worked for him in the firm then too. And so, yeah, Sullivan was the kind of crown jewel of firms in Chicago. Holberg and Root were there too. McKinley & White and Richardson are East Coast. So Sullivan, Holberg, and Root are drawing from Richardson because he's the national master. They're all picking up on his Richardson Romanesque architecture. Sullivan adapts it to modern language, and then Wright learns from Sullivan. Okay, so obviously, when you read these things, you saw that he's a bit of a phoenix rising in different parts of his career. First, he's knocked down by his personal habits with Mema and sort of a problem with society, a Christian society back then. That was number 1. And then came the Depression, which knocked everybody out. And finding the 30s, when you think his career was over, he started to receive these enormous, great worldwide commissions. And 3 of the list here are the World Heritage Sites. So which one is not part of that? Oh, sorry, and that should be for Allison. I got the list, and you guys don't.
I'm not fully sure on this one. Would it be the Herbert Jacobs residence?
Well, and that's what's weird about it, because that really is diminutive, and it really isn't on that list as the other ones, but the ones that really don't make that kind of presence worldwide globally is the one right there in Madison, down the street from the Madison students. It's probably the closest one to campus. It's right on University Street. It's called the Unitarian Meeting House. So that's a local great one for the state, but the other three are ones that the whole world knows about. And so Falling Water and Jacobs One, even though Jacobs One is also just off the university there, kind of by the mall, it's just remarkable because the whole world says you have to visit Jacobs One and Falling Water because they're on our list. And my first reaction to the Hollyhock House was to substitute Johnson Wax for it, because Johnson Wax was on the original 8 list to be put up for the medal, so to speak. And Johnson Wax says, thanks, but no thanks. We don't want that type of public annoyance of being anointed like that, because then you'd have droves of people always on their campus, and they're too restricted as a private company. So Unitarian Meeting House, even though it's a great building and you can access it, I think any day of the week except for Saturday when their congregation meets, I think for a student they'll let you in for $1 or $2 or whatever you want. Typically it's $5 for the general public. Okay, number 17. So here's what he's trying to make a life for himself, right? He's trying to, 1911, Taliesin burns down. He's admonished as this adulterer, anti-Christian, ungodly type of demon in the Midwest. And so after he gets the Midway Gardens Commission in 1913, from people who want him to build a beer garden because they don't care so much about his private life, what's his next major public commission, which kind of really bring back his name worldwide? And that would be, maybe I have to go back to the top now. Back to, well, I think our names, every time I go to the who's listening now, it kind of jumbles them. So let's go back to Tanner. What the heck? What do you think, Tanner, about this?
That was in Tokyo.
Tokyo, very good. So he gets the commission for the Imperial Hotel, which means the actual emperor is asking him to build this hotel, which will attract the Western people to come to something that's designed by America, but still use Japanese culture. And there's only one person the Japanese think about in terms of America, in terms of art design. And that's Wright, because they see he came from their language. He came from that Hoden Pavilion at the 1893 fair. And he's been over to Japan collecting their prints, and he understands there's a connection between where they've come from to where Wright took it into the modern language. So they hired him in that. He finished it about the mid-20s and became international acclaim there. Okay, then Ezekiel, back to you. The first independent commission inspired by the Hoden, these two are kind of related here, at the 1893's fair, is which of these 3 homes? Which is, it's not really the first Prairie House, but it's the one that kind of mothers all the future Prairie homes come 1900. Once again, the Winslow? Yeah, I can barely hear you, but if you said the Winslow, you're correct. It was the Winslow. That's the one. Oak Park and River Forest are kind of twin suburbs. So just across the border of the two, you'll find the Winslow home and a couple of the Wright homes right there, because by the turn of the 1890s towards 1900, he was the man to build your home in the western suburbs of Chicago. Anybody that wanted to do something progressive went to Wright. So there's literally, if you go to his home and studio in Oak Park on a weekend, pay the $10 to go inside there, whatever it is now, you can then get a map and you can walk around to 37 projects in the course of the day. It is so dense with Wright work. And the Winslow house should be on your list because that's what starts it all. Okay, so I'm also trying to get you to understand that Wright didn't come out of a vacuum. I don't think many people would end up being the type of genius aren't looking at other people the whole time. So Wright's early work also then inspires other people. So without Wright, you might not have had these four, except for one of them. So three of these are post-Wright, and then one isn't part of this inspiration. So that's a question for Dabia.
I'm not really sure, but is it the Russian construct?
Yeah, constructivism, Bauhaus, and style all championed Wright. They loved his work. Once, if you're like, these are all like people that are in their 20s and they want change because they can't believe what just happened in World War I. They have to radically change what architecture looks like. But how do you actually prove it makes sense until you find somebody who's accomplished it? And they found that crazy portfolio from Wasmuth. And here's this person at Oak Park River Forest who's already done it. So constructivism, Bauhaus, and style got their foundation for all their ideas directly from Wright. Wright got his foundation from the secessionists in Vienna. So that's the flip in this, is that the last one there actually inspired Wright. Okay, this one should be easy for most everybody. So Allison, kind of a giveaway here. Where was Wright born? Allison?
Oh, sorry, my thing wasn't working. He was born in Richland Center, Wisconsin.
Richland Center, very good, which is just a stone's throw outside of Spring Green. It's a little confusing there. Some people think because he built in Spring Green, he actually was going home. The land he bought, we bought from family members. So you'd think he was actually born then. He spent his youth on the farms around there, but actually was down the road about 9 miles in Richland Center. And I think we went through this in class as well as in your book there. So which one of these four is not a UNESCO site? I even mentioned it on the little quiz here earlier too, but for Ingram, which one's not a World Heritage Site?
You said it was Johnson Wax, correct?
Right, yeah, that was by their choice. They should have been on there. And this one should be a slam dunk for Max. Who was an inspiration to Wright?
What was it, all the above?
All the above, yeah. And I put that in there because I think, with your high school background and maybe family interest, things like that, these last names ought to be pretty common to you, because I think, Americans mandate you guys read some Emerson, read some Thoreau, and hopefully you listen to some Bach music. So, and Wright loved all this stuff. So even through music and through writing, you can see the languages of architecture emanate from that. So it doesn't just come from the visuals of like the Vienna Secessionists. It comes from what Wright read and what he listened to. So that's important to your careers too, to look at all the arts all the time. Okay, so in his firm, this is for Angela, if you're working next side to Wright or for him, and your career grows to international acclaim, that shows Wright's legacy. And this is kind of in that very first generation. Which one here wasn't part of that first generation of that legacy?
I'm gonna say Mies van der Rohe.
Right. So I mentioned that before. He was a compadre to him. They were friends. They were both in the Chicago area and stuff, but they never crossed roads in terms of firm wise and stuff. And probably the most important thing for the women in the class is that Wright's prominent graphic draftsperson was not the two Austrians who had brilliant careers themselves, but the hand of Marion Mahoney. A lot of people now who write about the early year of Wright said maybe Wright couldn't have done this without Marion in the firm too. She was kind of, because of a woman, she'd be the one that wouldn't get the press or give the credence for it, but a bulk of the drawings you see are her hand. And the designs that are carried out when Wright's not in the office are her ideas. And then eventually her husband's Walter Burley Griffin, who they marry and ended up having a career in Australia later on. Okay, last one, real easy for all of you. You don't have to tell me, but I hopefully you're on this. You've got to get to these buildings that are within the stone's throw of you from where you're seated right now, but you have to plan for it. So go back to the syllabus if you haven't done this yet and look through all the ones that you can drive to, no matter how far they are, but check the websites for all of them and see when they'll actually let you go inside. Because there's one thing to drive by things and say, here's a picture of me standing in front of the Jacobs one. But if you don't call the right people or go at the right time, you kind of waste your period because you've got to see the whole complexity of from the outside to the inside. So you see the whole type of maniacal design that wanted to carry through on every aspect. Every aspect you see in these spaces is touched by the hand of Wright, which is unusual for architects to have that much control. So make sure you stay on top of that because it's not going to happen last minute here in late April when you have to get the 2 sites to kind of finish off the class, because obviously if you travel to Europe and you go to Paris and you don't go to the Eiffel Tower, that's kind of silly. So if you live in Wisconsin and you're from Madison, Milwaukee, and Taliesin is drivable on a Saturday morning, that's kind of silly too, because you're studying it. That's part of your sort of lexicon for design. So I'm not saying you have to do Taliesin, but there's a whole series of things. They've got a lot of opera hours for you. Some are easy, some are more difficult. If you're really desperate on one in particular, ask me and I'll tell you who I know who might be able to get you in, things like that. But I think it's really worthy for you to have this come to life for you. And we got way too many people to try to design a class trip for one day, because that'll cut too many people out, and we can't manage that. But you can now get to 2 sites yourself, and that's just as important as anything you draw or something you read. You have to actually visit these sites. Okay, so score yourself. If you didn't do well, it's obvious what you need to do. You need to step back to that biography and get closer to it, because that's the presence of somebody telling you a story that we don't have time for on our Tuesday nights. That can sit with you on the couch at night, and you kind of read through that. And as you do your design, you'll see yourself pulled into those biographies and become closer and closer to Mr. Wright. Okay, so here we are. We'll zip back out to Taliesin here. Obviously, the students in Madison are closest to this. It'd take you about 40 minutes to get here. It is basically the east-west route. It's actually called Frank Lloyd Wright Way once you leave Wisconsin off at 12. And you simply head to the Mississippi, and after about 40 minutes from Madison, you curl off of 14 up here, and it takes you down some little trunk road and gets you on to 23. So you want to be on Wisconsin 23, which kind of frames the property. So this will loop you all the way down to Dodgeville. Turn the corner here and you're heading down to House on the Rock, for instance. If some of you have been there, you know what I'm talking about. That's kind of crazy in a good way and crazy in a bad way. But right on County C then, as you come off of there, right, you make this turn, you will see at this little intersection, you'll see the cantilevered walkway that's so iconic on the edge of Taliesin in the distance, so you know you're there. Typically, right at this intersection, you want to start at the restaurant gift shop, and that's where the preservation office is too, and kind of get a ticket to tour or purchase something there, read more about it, or get a view from there. It's also a Wright design building that he did in, I think, early 50s. And then if you take the tour, the 1 or 2 hour, it'll take you in a red bus and kind of start you over at Hillside, through the property, Midway Farm, and up to Taliesin to walk around. And they get all different scales of price points for you. They should have student rates as well. It's going to be really limited until the spring comes around, not till like March or April, they'll start opening up on weekends again, because they really closed down in the same pattern that Wright did when they had the active school here at the Hillside School. That's the drafting studio for it. And then most of the students lived on either side of the drafting room. They have little small apartments, so to speak, next to it. And then Mr. Wright, Mrs. Wright would live up here. He had his drafting studio, and the firm was kind of constrained up in this area, some here and some there, of course, of time. And they simply then kind of grew their own firm. Now it's all sort of subbed out to other farmers in the area, but they will have special events for tours where they'll harvest. People will come and harvest the food, and they'll prepare it and they'll cook it under the stars at night in the summer. That's one of those extravagant tourist tickets for a couple $100. You can experience Taliesin on all different levels here, is they really commit to being an environmental center as they move forward. So we're going to look at this really quick and draw this from this vantage point. It's not quite due north. The Wisconsin River is a little bit over here. You'll pass it on this trunk road. If you took 23 back north, you'll end up in Spring Green across the river. So it's not literally in the city of Spring Green, but it's counted as that as a mailing address. So when you get to Taliesin, you'll see it's on a big bluff, and we saw that before. If this is, the model itself of the house proper expanded in scale, now we put it on its hillside, and it will look like this, kind of with the same pitch. An all-white model with this plastic product doesn't really hold light that well, but this is the southern exposure as the light's lighting up all the different pieces of the original. I believe I've never really honored what they say square footage was, how they count that, but it's at least 12,000 square feet for sure, probably more for the house proper. Once you started adding all the admin things that actually worked the farm and developed all the way out here to the chicken coop to the west, it's probably closer to 30,000 square feet of residential space. And typically realtors call it square footage if it's heated or air conditioned, because that means it's hard architecture. So you don't really count the wing wall out here, secondary spaces. It's really sort of the interior space itself as the square footage. Anyway, it's a very large, exotic single family residence because it's got the home, the studio, and the farm kind of working on this big structure on the top of the hill. And I think I mentioned before that this isn't a complete model. They just sort of stopped because this is what the drone did for them. If they were to actually come down to grade from the top of the high point here with the big oak tree, collapsed in a storm years ago, about 15 years ago now. It's about a 90-foot drop down to the pond that Wright had sort of engineered to create some hydroelectric over a little dam there for them. So that's what we're trying to manifest here from our drawings, is to work from drone, our HABs drawings of ink on Mylar, to create a 10-foot by 10-foot model of this aspect of Taliesin. Yeah, good.
Why?
Okay, all done. You're gonna get that? So our process is I hire students on grants. A couple of UWM students are working on this now, where they're working with all our digital files to create sections at a time to make sure the detail is going to be appropriate along the way.
There you go.
Good, thanks.
There you go.
Great. So for instance, the projection of the bird walk, which we've read about, which came later in the growth of the home so that Ogavana could be closer to the trees here and the singing birds in the morning. Some people write about that Wright was actually threatened by what the modern movement had done in Europe, and so he wanted to show some of his structural prowess by projecting this great cantilevered out over the valley. Lots of different stories that become more mystical over time. But you can see right now we're a little bit stumbling through how much a drone could actually pick up information and what we really need to show in terms of the general public when this is sort of a room-size model in a museum that people walk around on all four edges, and then we could project down PowerPoints on top of it to talk about when different parts were built between Taliesin 1, 2, and 3. One is the home and studio in 1911 that burned then as soon as it was completed. So that's the first part, that's Taliesin 1. Wright rebuilds it within the fall, starts right away after Mama gets murdered in that weekend, as well as the woman he was entertaining and the children and the people at the event there. And then in 1925, there was electrical fire from a storm that came by, and apparently some winds and some storms, some electricity connected with the house electricity, and a fire started and people couldn't put that out. So now what you're looking at here, all of this is actually Taliesin 3 that Wright built up for the rest of his career there. And the only original part from 1911 is this wing here. That was from that earliest date. So our goal in some capacity is to build this shows the 1/8-inch scale to my hands what it's going to look like. We don't even know what scale this was. It was just to fit in the box. Whereas this we know is 1/8, and that's the scale of what we're looking at. We just have to decide how much detail we want to put in the model as we build it out. And that way it'll be a better way for people to fully understand that, because obviously just looking at the floor plan of Taliesin, it's way too abstract. And you want to kind of look at it almost like residence by residence as you make your way across the property from east to west here. Okay, so for us then, as you're looking for your third sketch base, which should say Tal in the lower right, down here. And job number one, and us trying to articulate this, is to look at any 2 or 3 diagonals. This is the top of the masonry chimney here. There's one over there when that chimney turns. There's one at the base of this triangular roof that faces to the south and comes back, but all those lead to the same point on the horizon line. And so that's very important. It's very important for us to find that left vanishing point because it's kind of the closest one to us, because Taliesin is such a sprawling complex. If we set up close to the building and wanted to draw one aspect of it, we could show kind of like the Unity Temple or like the Roby House, we could show the entire thing, and then one point would be on the page, one would be off. But what I'm trying to show here is just kind of the spectacle of what you first see when you approach the building, this kind of accretive bit of landscape of architecture that actually seems like it's growing out of the hill. And so I pulled back the idea of the view shed of this so that we're going to be right in the middle of the building's mass here. So that horizon line runs all the way across, right at the base of the whole bank of windows by their bedrooms facing east. And we'll see that our eye height will be a little bit just above the catwalk here and the projection of the great prolonged bird walk, which faces due east or a little bit southeast. And that might be, in terms of how we see that, is over time, if we're up looking at this view shed, this is actually sort of diminished in its ability to hold true in terms of the structure because it was such an aggressive cantilever over here. So the tick marks here will help us kind of make sure when you draw along with me, we all stay in relationship to the size of the paper we're working on. But knowing that if and the whole building's orthogonal, except for the pitched roofs, the hip roof we'll look at, but even the base of the pitched roofs is a horizontal line. They're still going to come back and vanish, even the ones going to the right. It seems like it might be parallel there, but that's going to come down to the horizon line. So every horizontal line you do has to be delicately placed, rushing down to that point. And then the ones below it are going to rush up to that point. But as you can see, the right vanishing point is probably 6 or 7 inches off the paper. And that's not ideal, but the problem is if I brought them in closer, our drawing would be way too small for the detail we want to kind of articulate. So I prefer to have one point off the page so we can get closer to the building and draw it bigger. So let's talk about the idea of Taliesin. So it means shining brow, Welsh word, completed in 1911 in the driftless area of Wisconsin, which again is 40 minutes west of Madison. We're looking at Taliesin 3 now because of the 2 fires there. And after that, in 1932, in terms of what it's used for, beyond just being his home and studio, he solves the problem of the depression in his future by making it a fellowship. So he's going to be the grand architect that's going to have people work for him and give them that architectural experience, almost like the Bauhaus in Germany. So what we want to do is establish where we are in the site, because right now it looks like we're on land, and we're not at all. Basically, from this point of support, which the rest of the bird walk projects from, that's the last bit of structure for that. That's going to be received by a cascading hill that runs down here, right at the base of it. And we'll see a little bit of the lip of the mound coming down over there that runs down too, but the whole hill is falling away from the structure. And that's hard to draw with perspective lines because it's not a box, it's not vanishing in space. But if we just did a little bit on the feet of our language here, every so often, we'll get the idea of something cascading down away from the home. And then we come over to the piers on this side. Each time we do that, we get closer to a vanishing point. If we were right here, that cascading line would be vertical. So each one's going to rush closer and closer to vertical as it comes towards us. And that sort of sets it on the idea of it being, if you kind of feel your own forehead now, your whole head is the hill proper. And so Taliesin is your forehead. It's the shining brow of what that Welsh word is for that name Taliesin. And that's what Wright sort of picked that off of in terms of that language. So he was a bard, so he's sort of a writer, speaker, author in Welsh lore. And that radiant brow is through the poet Richard Hovey. It's called Taliesin a Mask. And it's a story about an artist's struggle for identity. So just those words of what Taliesin is in terms of how it's written, that you see what Wright's doing here is that now he's come back and he's lost his entire identity up to that point by leaving his family behind and then having his wife and the love of his life sort of intellectually axe bludgeoned, set on fire, and part of this just tumultuous end with her and her family members at Taliesin proper. So to name this Taliesin has got that kind of signature piece, how he's reinventing himself at this particular time in his life. So we got the sense, and yet we can't show where the hill keeps going because it keeps rising behind the house and eventually crests in the courtyard here. So we're drawing from beneath this side up through the building. So the hill's going to get higher and higher until it reaches its peak right about here where that oak is part of the top of that hill, probably planted 150 years before Wright got there, because typically oaks kind of are born for 100 years, they live for 100 years, it takes them 100 years to die, so they typically have a 300-year period. And so this one was old enough that it was claimed by that storm that one night. And so the hill rushes behind that. So this isn't the height of the hill. The height of the hill is actually behind here. But we can't see that land because the house is blocking it. What we can see are some of the trees in the distance that are mature enough that they still rise up above the home proper. So we're going to put a couple, and we're just going to abstract these. I don't put a literal sense of where they are, just to give some value relationship to what our mass is. And then in the distance, it might be the same height as this, but it's going back in perspective. So the height of this tree is only this tall, the distance there. So there's still our major trees because, believe it or not, that's the high point for where Taliesin is, but the rest of the hill keeps going up. So when you leave the western portion of the house, you actually drive up to the local parking area where they have people. If they're elderly, they get to park right over here on the north parking lot. But most people who work here are asked to park sort of out of view on the top of the hill towards the west. So to kind of frame this, because, you know, Wright would always stylize the drawings and have kind of one edge be more dominant and have the drawing kind of go off in perspective towards the other, we're going to come to this tower in the backdrop, which is the 1911 piece we see on the other end of that courtyard, and draw the top of that tower going back to our vanishing point. We'll do the pitch roof in a little bit, but then we'll show the trees beyond that, and then the edge of another strong tree, which is on the south side of the building. So we're going to have this tree kind of become the left edge of a sort of an L-shaped drawing that goes out this way. And the point of our drawing is to get people stand on that bird walk over to the right. So we just have to do some boxes in space now to kind of structure the array of things here. And what's nice about Taliesin is you really can't make too many mistakes, because if you put enough of the ideas together, it's so accretive and abstract. There was a writing author named Levine, and he highlighted the abstract nature because he wrote about Wright being connected to the works of Pablo Picasso, who always was very expressionistic and abstract in terms of how he puts form on the page, seeing a glass from multiple images at once, so you show all the views in one view of it instead of just what the glass you're looking at. Taliesin's a very hard floor plan to remember. It's a very hard building to draw succinctly, but that's no problem because it's meant to be experiential and not just sort of honored from one axial position. So we'll start with our bird walk that comes over and meets the building. And so we've got the box that faces south and the one that rushes up on the east side. And we won't see the other two sides of it. And then right here, we've got the one box beneath it which we don't see the base because it hits the ground, but that's the last support. So it's basically a third of it comes to this point and the rest projects out into space. And you can feel that when you come to the end, even one person jumping, you're getting a lot of vibration because it's a really long projection, probably against code these days. Okay, and then we'll come to a box here as it rotates over. There's a side piece that truncates. And that sets up this really long southern, excuse me, eastern, quasi southeastern, northeastern terraced wall, which sets up kind of this great horizontal base. And then right tucks underneath that, secondary apartments and units for living underneath, which then have walls that run down to the ground and create openings for the people who are going to be in the lower level. So today they're used for artists and residences and certain lecturers that come by and talk about the building. So there's a whole array of masonry types of units that break up the space beneath this projected volume up here. So Mr. and Mrs. Wright are coming out of their bedrooms and enjoying their morning coffees and things. There's another sort of workaday world beneath that kind of cascades, because even though it looks like it might be a 1 or 2 story building that sits out on the prairie, because it sits on the hill and the hill's rushing away, at some points it's actually a 5-story structure. From the lowest level of the basement to the top of where the kids would see space over the living areas is a 5-story building. So that's how all this the square footage kind of adds up as it kind of builds up over time there. And that works over to another bastion of stone that comes over and kind of then breaks, goes back toward the vanishing point, breaks again. And so we see these sort of cubic volumes are going to wrap around the space. And then it's going to break those down into secondary sections of how they're used in detail. Some might be the finish of stone the whole way. Some might be stone into stucco. Depends on how much you can quarry from the local river areas there. Because he was obviously on a budget, he didn't use traditional concrete footings for all this. He did a lot of compacted sand things and was kind of doing stuff relative to his budget. And his budget wouldn't have been too high because even though it's a very large building, he didn't have a whole lot of clients at the time due to what happened the half decade before. So this rotates over to sort of the southern deck as you retreat to the face of the one that looks east. And then it wraps to a long bar that keeps going and projects for once he leaves his office over here on the far southern wing, he pops out onto another private terrace on this side. And that projects even further to the edge of our sketch over here. And we'll kind of let that go and kind of clean that up with some vegetation later because it's even more expansive than what our piece of paper can hold here. If I would have shown the edge of all this, it would have made the drawing even more diminutive here. I want to make sure we could focus on the main story and a half structure that faces east here. So then on top of that, we've got a projection of a flat roof that comes out from a pitch roof above it. And we see the little pitch meet its masonry chamber there. So that's a hip roof that runs up and then butts into a masonry edge. So again, boxes in space, a larger box there. You see the side coming down in chimney fashion. And then over the living space on this side, it cuts down to the north, wraps around this side, up and back over. So you have a series of shapes now that are going to connect all these masonry forms will run through the building. If you ever get a chance to look, obviously we have copies and sets of the Habs drawings. And what really helped us anchor all the drawings together was we knew that periodically there are major shafts of the stonework that are going to run from here all the way down to the foundation that Wright had designed for it. So the verticals help set up sort of our partitioning of all the floor plans we were doing summer by summer. It started in 1994 and we finished the set of drawings this past summer. So here's a projection of a 2-story volume. Looking to the south over here, and that roof comes down. This one runs to about this point. In front, we have another projection. Its roof vanished to that left point. It's over this way. Wright's over his roof space is a lower level roof that's going to meet this one. and run over. And now to kind of help those sit in space, we're going to use a little bit of value to kind of articulate the relationship between what's being lit up by the sun and what's being held by interior space. So that's why I have these bands of strokes through here, so we can kind of keep some of the white area, which even it's a dark stained wood, but it's much lighter in the sunlight than the rest of the interiors will be. So coming across the front here on the edge of the stone ending at this point under the eave, you start to see, and do this kind of in strokes, it'll come all the way down to our porch area, maybe 2 per piece of fenestration. And you leave the white area left for the actual structure that will support the glazing there. It doesn't have to be clearly exact, because we can assume that some of the very small 2 foot wide, very tall doors would be open or closed at the time looking at it. But that'll run to a certain point and set back beneath this very large hipped roof here. And that'll be the same when it comes in. There's a cast shadow that we'll look at later, and another cast that will, thanks to this point, will come to this edge, and the same thing happens, and you'll see this detail when you visit Taliesin, that pattern comes here, and rather than sit it on opaque structure, he stops the structure there and then has glass go right to the edge. So there is no architecture on the edge of that glass there. And that's sort of a Wright detail where we want to have that corner living space, be able to see the whole expanse from the east, wrapping to the north, to the west of the Wisconsin River, which bends in front of the home here. And he gets this whole sort of notion of this, I think, in his European time when he's over there working on the illustrations for the Westmouth portfolio. He's actually, he's separated from Cheney over there because Mame actually had a job of her own over there. So she'd be going from different towns and cities in Europe, and Wright would base outside of Florence in a little town called Fiesole. And he was inspired by Michelozzo's Villa Medici, which is obviously a Renaissance building from that time period, Michelozzo, but it was built into a hill, the sort of Florentine hillscape outside of Florence, and had commanding views of its surrounding. So Wright didn't pick up on its architecture, he picked up on the siting of it. So it would feature gardens on multiple levels, and then he could think about his land back in Spring Green at the time. And so while he was over there developing the book to be sold on his first part of his career, he was thinking about his Renaissance, his rebirth himself in Spring Green. So then dropping down here, this whole thing is much deeper than the house beneath it. So that'll make this really sing in light. Once we come in and do a dark tone, it keeps this whole area down there in shade. And that'll come down the edge of this wall, drop a little bit in there. This will just be a placeholder for now. We're going to come back and add more value in a little bit, but that helps float that then over later on the principle. So this little piece he has articulated there will also then cast a shadow onto its support wall. It runs up. So coming down here at an angle, back into that space, and then beneath. So that space. To help this float, just like we did here, we're going to create the value behind that. So the way the light is situated from a vantage point, it'll cast a shadow on that pier that's starting the cantilever. And it'll take the whole area that's not receiving light because of this and make the area of the architecture and the landscape behind it a darker value. So where the top of the hill hits, this whole area goes dark right up to that pier. So we start to show then these ambient spaces of light, dark, shade and shadow, hill, architecture, stone, wooden structure, cantilevered, all start to be sort of a sculptural piece. So wrapping around here, this projects over that stone wall there. We have the architecture come down to this projection so that that's deeper in there, wraps around the corner, and this receives a cast shadow too. The pier runs out in the front, that'll set up on top of that. and just push further and further back. It routinely makes it away around the composition. So if there's a pier that supports, it's set behind the actual cantilever. It's not to the edge of it, so there's cast shadow on that. Then the cantilever goes deeper and deeper back in there. So it's not just coming and sitting on the edge of the hill and being a mass. It seems like it's growing out of the hill as well. It's cantilevering out of that where land slides beneath it as well. And that comes down to a point where we lose the site because there is some growth and vegetation in the foreground that blocks our view of seeing around towards Wright actual piece of projected balcony. But we come back into Wright Studio. And add that value in. For his windows that are going to be shorter because they don't have the girth of this taller space here for the series of bedrooms that go north-south through the property. And as we project back, we know that these, and we'll detail them in stone later as they're quarried locally. We'll have the pieces that kind of are celebrated as this is the edge. Of the great roofing tiles, the wood shakes that run the whole building, and then make a break with the value of the roof lines themselves in the sky above. So we then have the plane of the hill that moves beneath the building, the plane of the cast shadows, the plane of people walking around in space around the sculpture, the plane of where people live, and the plane of the hat above the people, which is just this great. And this is just, we're looking at this view of it. We're just looking at this part, this massing of it from the east, basically. Just imagine the amount of this energy on all different sides here as you move around the actual sculptural piece of Taliesin. So again, it's incredibly memorable, but not specific to anything. It's more about an experiential play of form and light. Now, to sort of help us have a foreground, middle ground, background, we'll use some vegetation here. This is our subject of middle ground. We're going to use the 1911 building with its 2.5-story tower here in the back. If that's the eave, that's going to project over, and then we'll see the height of that. And we'll see a little bit, because we're far enough away, the actual pitch of its hip roof, just a little bit, and some value to match that. And on top of that is its masonry chimney, which, because it's perpendicular, also goes back to that Rice vanishing point. And so that tower is kind of a nice hallmark for people who know Taliesin. They're going to go, well, I understand the view now, because between this building and that building stands the courtyard. So this will come down and then have its secondary piece, which has another hip roof beneath it. And they're a great sort of 1 and 2 relationship of one supporting the other, which Wright repeated at the Romeo and Juliet tower. So another lower hip there. Then the building marches back to create that U shape behind what we can see here. So another hipped roof in the front. And then there's a series of windows that continue beyond this masonry piece in that section. So what creates the pattern that we had over here, just smaller in scale. So Unity Temple was a pretty tight sketch. Roby was a pretty tight sketch. This is going to be a little more nebulous in terms of finality to it, because it's more about the emotive quality of the building, less about the specifics of it. Because there are some very specific things. When you come in and stand here, that's a very specific view. When you come to this corner and see the river, that's very specific. When you enter the living room, you're just absolutely blown away by, oh, I get it, because this is why this house is here. And so singularly around the way, there's very sort of key things where obviously the cameras are pointed. But when you kind of end the day, you realize it was an experience. It wasn't just a series of pictures. It was movement through the artwork itself. So this piece comes down and casts a little shadow. And now what we're going to do is come over to the projection of these little volumes and show their cast shadows onto their stucco side. And then say that our eastern exposure this time in the morning will make the due south a little bit darker, so we wrap around that corner there. Now we can use our value for the nature around it, and we'll go light first and see how much you want to add to it. So this large tree, which is to the south of the building, we'll have come up and kind of infill this area to show how the architecture is being dissolved by it. We'll bring it down to some more of the more foliage-like ground cover, which makes its way up the hill in certain aspects, but it's mostly just sort of a rough kind of brush grown 2 or 3 feet high that covers the whole hill, unless they actually do some type of growing, which would be on the flatlands adjacent to it. But then that would rush right up to the base of these and create a stark difference between the walls themselves and what the architecture is doing relative to that. So there's a big change between our grade coming down the hill and the stone of the architecture. So we're going to take that all the way up and around to meet the base of the building. Oh. So we'll work with this base a little bit. Right now, it's just simply articulating the how we're going to hold that space to build a hill up, because we don't want to bring the value down to the base of the page, because our subject is going to be really keyed in to this section of the building as we move forward. We need a little bit of tone for the backdrop, and these would just be sort of monolithic, because we don't want to show too much detail in that distance either, given our time frame here. But we want some contrast between that and the stonework. And then in the distance here, it just doesn't fall off to water directly. There's still more of the forestry before you get glimpses of the Wisconsin River over here. So we will take beyond the edge of this, and we'll christen that us to hold space to say that's our definitive edge of where we're going to stop the sketch to. And then in the distance, these mature trees will simply go kind of on a perspective line back to that horizon, so we can have kind of a soft veil of tone that'll wash off toward the horizon line. And a distance over here, we'll see more of, as the hill rotates around the house and goes to the north side, the hill's coming up from that side. So we'll see the shrubs and trees that might be creeping up like these do over here, that will kind of stop our view underneath the base of that walkway. And that should be enough to kind of detail the northern edge of the property there. Okay, now if we take, because we want to differentiate what Wright did this with, because it's not a great building in terms of quality materials. It'll seem kind of epic when you get there, but it's showing its wear, being 111 years old now, of sort of modest materials, because he is just stone quarried from the local riverbeds and quarries in the area, and then the stucco, which is just a sort of rough patch type of finish there, and the rest is just stained woods on the outside. And that's taken a beating on the top of the hill facing north and east over these years. And I'm not sure Wright thought it was a building for the ages, and probably would fight the idea of too much historic preservation and prefer maybe just building something new. But we're trying to save this to make sure it has that mantle of a UNESCO site for the rest of the world here. So we're going to come back, and because again, it's a very small detail, we're going to give the idea of it and not try to oversell with too much delineation. But in perspective, we can quickly show some lines that might vanish back to the left vanishing point coming off of this one, and then return it to the right as you make that corner, because that's a really important stone pier that comes down through the stucco here and then continues beneath it in stucco, and then eventually to stone at the base. So we'll continue the stone here. And right where it touches the ground, because you want the most durable material, it's a stone product. And we're going to regulate it now just to make sure it all vanishes appropriately. The base of the cantilever also does that. And just kind of gives a gesture for it. And then turn the corner and turn the corner there. And so people can see that, okay, now your three materials, we've got the earthen, we've got stone quality, and we've got the white, which will appear like a singular skin of material like a stucco product. I'm going to do a little bit of fenestration up here on the second level. Okay, then we want to do is just to show that it's not a pure masonry product where all the bricks or the stones the same. It's actually very individual types found irregular. And so we're going to highlight some of the cast shadows individually on those, just at the top, at the crest, somewhere in the bottom, just kind of do it randomly. So it's got a little bit of texture or romance of the variability of nature in it. And once people see a little of it, again, like anything, they're going to infer that for the rest of the sketch as you move along here. So now we see some undulation there. You can probably do a little bit on this one because it's also kind of a twin piece of chimney movement through the vertical here, kind of the trunk of the tree that the branches hang off of. But we're going to die that out because we don't want to take too much information toward the edge of the sketch over here. I'll leave that alone for there. And then at the edge of this piece, it's got its fenestration that comes up to meet the underside of the roof over here. And then we'll see some darker projection from that roof pitch onto the side of that wall. And then because it projects out over here, it's darker on that edge as well. We'll take the underside of that, and that throw of the dark will come down from this edge and wash the top of the windows, the value as well too. Okay, so we're closing in on this. It's we've got about 9 minutes left, and so we're going to work with our sense of trying to complete this in terms of our full value, because we've got page white and we've got little bits of black here, and the bulk of the sketch so far is probably 40 or 50% gray. We're going to do the drawing over several times now with the most in 80%, a little bit less than 90, and very little at 100%, but that'll help pull out the essence of the drawing and that value. So we're looking for points which are going to be most important to us. And so initially I want a sharpened pencil, because if it's dull, you're not going to get that precision that you need here. But we want to come to our chimney tops, our bastions here, and show those edges. And the edges are roof lines as they move through the space. And the edge of the building between the front we see here now and then what's in the distance. And make sure that edge is strongest against its backdrop. And wrap it all the way around to this edge, turn that corner. And then again, it's projecting beyond here. So the top half of these window areas are going to get a little more cast shadow onto them. So that's critical. And then our edge to float this against its backdrop. Make sure that edge is coming all the way around the corner here, because beneath our horizon line. And then the kind of projection of space and volume over here. This may receive a little bit of light. Yeah, it's underside over there. And we're going to push more depth in it, because right now you sort of cloak the wall, but actually when you get inside these spaces, there actually are openings and windows that'll take us back into those secondary spaces that are deeper in there. So we're going to, without seeing too much of them, we want to indicate that we know that there's apartments down below. So we'll do a quick indication of something happening back in there. And we'll work around the front part, which comes closest to us. This one edge comes over, so that'll be a little change in the value of somebody standing there. And we can do it as a reference point if you want to put Mr. and Mrs. Wright in the image now. If our horizon line is right at that point and they're looking down from there, the height of them coming out of their door there would be about this tall, with maybe arms on the balcony looking out. The tone, maybe a little bit shorter, Mrs. Right there. Overlooking their view of their southeastern valley there. And then the projection of this like E that comes to the front. We'll throw a nice cast shadow on our stone pier here. Take that back around the corner. So it shows the movement of the space in the 3 dimensions. And now we're going to push again with another sharpened fine pencil towards more of 90%. And so now all this glassed area has got a whole lot more detail of design and information beyond the glass. And it really isn't discernible. It just carries a different tone to it because it's even a deeper value that isn't receiving natural light or artificial light on the interior. So we want to make it sort of random, not too monolithic, otherwise it'll neutralize it. So just go wherever there is glazing and simply change it at the top, maybe darker, along one side, maybe on both sides, maybe just at the bottom, and animate all those panels of glass along the way with different strokes of darkness or light. Sometimes there could be furniture right by the windows that move across the bottom, and sometimes the top, it could be the projection of space coming back at an angle where the ceiling receives less light than the walls that are getting struck by the sun. And so you could have that kind of perspective going back to that vantage point there. In this case, there's glass around here, so we could see the vegetation here that might be dark run to that glass, to this glass, to that glass, and then diminish. So we see into the space and then through the space to the other side as the glass goes around the corner. Come back in and edge our framework of vegetation, which is kind of a writing trick to actually show some of the leafing work on the edge of the sketch over here, and make that be kind of the starting point for the language of how the drawing is going to begin on the left and then push out toward the vantage point over here on the right. Because the due east is probably the stronger light, like we turn the corner here, will probably come on the walkway and kind of move it right to the tip so that it's a little bit stronger right where it makes the corner there. So it goes from a darker type of light to a lighter, but the brightest part is the one that projects out due east, and that'll throw that piece away from the home a little bit further. Probably depth and darkness within here as that gets lost and deeper on the underside of that, going back towards something happening underneath this great walkway. And then to say that our entourage of trees in the back, which look like a flat panel now, we'll just articulate the ones that are a little bit closer to us, to have a little more definition at their base, adjacent to the home, and then we can kind of fade away and not show the ones that are further away from us. To articulate those a little bit more. And now back to the foreground one last time. Again, we want to shape this left third as we start from here and kind of dissipate out here so it'll be stronger with the darker stuff, the routine right in front of us, which isn't really necessarily an object of art itself, but it's just kind of a diagram of nature that starts to frame our subject. And then that will then enhance its adjacent tone of the hill kind of moving across here. So as it moves down, it also moves kind of horizontally or diagonally and creates different light patterns. And we'll just dissipate that out a bit. So that we want it strongest right where it meets the base of the home, because that's where it'll appear darkest next to a white area. So give the architecture something really strong to sit on. And then kind of fade that away. And toward the edge of the hill over here where the mountain actually ends, you can actually walk around that on the underside. We'll probably go to a little bit darker tone just to end the hill at that edge. So that will leave us with a sketch of Taliesin. From this viewpoint. Right there, looking up towards the hill. It's promontory there. You can see the shining brow, rotation over there to the grand courtyard, to the tower that we saw in the backdrop there, but with foreshortening, it showed up on our sketch just above to the left of the structure. So we don't get it too much attention, but it does iconically show us that's the end of the courtyard from this vanishing point. So the fellowship closed a couple of years ago, so there's no active School of Architecture here now. So we're actively working with a series of groups to work on programming Taliesin in the future to see what to do there. There could be a role for you if you're interested in that, in preservation or K-12 education or activating this for the campuses at Madison and Milwaukee, because it's a great resource. It's the most significant thing, as somebody said, it's Wright's own self-portrait. There's a man named O'Gorman, who was a writer of architecture, said it's not a mere building, but it's an entire environment in which man, architecture, and nature form a harmonious whole. Campbell, who wrote an architecture, said it's his candidate for the title of the greatest single building in America. You've got to visit this place. You've drawn it, you're going to learn more about it. It is the pulse of Frank Lloyd Wright, and completes the picture of one of the four great modern masters. So we're a week out from another submission, round 2 of schematic design. Anxious to see that. Again, just cleaning that up. Make sure you go to the points we talked about last week and make sure you're sort of certified you've made adjustments from that, whether it was regards to your work or critique of your peers' work. It was all about your work through other people's projects too. So what they accomplished, looked at that to be sort of like the litmus test for you. What you accomplished, it's the litmus test for them to keep their project active and growing. Each issue here through this, by the time we get to the final submission, will make this thing a fairly complete residence. You should be pretty proud of it. I can stick around for questions. The rest of you, good night. Keep drawing, pen before mouse.